Welcome to the Dublin City Library's podcast. In this episode, entitled Fleapits, Palaces and Multiplexes, Dublin City Historian in Residence Katie Blackwood explores the history of cinemas in Dublin. Listen to stories about the makeshift venues of the early days, the 1930s palaces of entertainment, and the suburban cinemas of the mid to late 20th century. This episode was recorded in May 2024.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the cinema was a new medium for communal storytelling around the world. What effect did the cinema have, and how was it experienced by the people of Dublin? Hello and welcome to Fleapits, Palaces and Multiplexes, a history of Dublin cinemas. I'm Katie Blackwood, historian in residence for the Dublin North Central area, and this podcast is going to take us through the history of cinemas in Dublin from its rough and ready beginnings through to the golden age of cinema building in the 1930s and right up to the emergence of multiplexes in the 1990s. When I was a child, we used to go to the Classic cinema in Harold's Cross, and the Classic even then was a really old style cinema. And I always remember that feeling of anticipation. You know, going into the cinema had a sort of a magical quality. And you'd be queuing up for your tickets, the smell of the popcorn, the feel of the carpet underneath your feet. The usher would lead you to your seat. And then that feeling of excitement as the lights go down and the red curtain sweeps aside and the film begins and you're transported to another world and completely absorbed in the story. So I'm indebted to the people of Dublin who've generously shared their cinema-going memories and stories with me, some of which will feature in this podcast. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Towards the end of the 19th century, there were several inventors working on different types of moving images, but the one that's generally regarded as being the blueprint for the cinema was the Lumiere brothers' cinematograph, which was a type of camera and a projector in one. It was light and portable, so it could capture moving images outside of a studio environment, and it could project the images for an audience. In December 1895, the Lumiere brothers held their first commercial showing in Paris, where the public paid in to view a selection of real-life documentary-style films. This included a 46-second clip of workers leaving the Lumiere factory. And it was just that, a single long shot of a doorway with people walking through it and then turning left or right. But the audience had never seen anything like this before. It was reality being played back to them. It was new and exciting, and viewers were enthralled. This was the beginning of the cinema as a business. On the 20th of April, 1896, so just 4 months after the Lumiere's debut in Paris, the first Irish screening of moving images was shown at Dan Lowry's Star of Erin Theatre of Varieties, which today we know as the Olympia Theatre on Dame Street. According to reports, it wasn't particularly successful, with poor image quality and problems getting the projector to work. But nevertheless, moving pictures had arrived, and Dublin, as a prominent city in the British Empire, was very much keeping up with the times. Initially, living images, or electric images, as they were known, were a bit of a novelty. They were shown in makeshift venues, often as part of a travelling show or a fair, or they might make up a small part of a live stage show in a theatre. And of course, the early films were all in black and white, and they were silent. So musicians were employed to accompany the on-screen images, and it was much more akin to a live theatre or a musical act than the cinema we know today. So the story goes that in 1909, the first dedicated cinema space in Dublin was established, and it was the Volta Theatre, located at 45 Mary Street. This was a converted shop, and it was set up and run by none other than James Joyce himself. He had been living in Trieste in Italy, which had several picture houses, and his sister Eva suggested opening one in Dublin. Everyone thought it was a good idea. Some of Joyce's Italian friends financed it, and he returned to Dublin to set it up. According to reports at the time, the cinema was attractively finished with the most decorative front entrance and a commodious auditorium that could hold a large number of people. The interior was richly decorated in a colour scheme of crimson and light blue and was furnished with every convenience for the comfort and safety of its patrons. The Volta showed silent Italian films and operas that were accompanied by either a live orchestra or a gramophone record. And even though the films were silent, the intertitles, so the bits of text in between which would have the dialogue or important plot points, were all in Italian, which your average Dubliner couldn't understand. So the manager used to hand out printed summaries of the plot to people as they went in so that they could understand what was going on. But it proved to be a bit of a stretch for your average Dubliner, and unfortunately business did not boom. And Joyce didn't hang around either. After 7 months he sold up and returned to Italy, and he only ever visited Dublin once more in his life. A cinema continued at this site and was renamed as the Lyceum in 1921. It closed in 1947 and the building was demolished in the 1960s. However, today, if you look closely the next time you're going into Penny's on Mary Street, you'll see a small plaque commemorating the site of the former cinema, which does say it was Ireland's first dedicated cinema. But there's always more than one side of any story in history, and Dennis Condon, a film historian, maintains that, in fact, the People's Popular Picture Palace at the former Queen's Theatre on Brunswick Street, which is now Pearse Street, was the first dedicated cinema space in Dublin, opening a full 2 years before the Volta. And in contrast to the Volta, it was wildly popular with Dublin audiences, showing a mixture of adventure stories and melodramas. A description of the opening night by architect and theatre critic Joseph Holloway describes large queues to get in the door, and he continues, "The excitement in the street outside was fully maintained inside. I got standing room on the upper circle for 6 pence. The house was thronged in every part. Smoking was freely indulged in, and the whole house was agog with excitement. The event of the programme, the story of the Kelly gang, was then announced amid sensation, as they say in a murder trial, and the story was dramatically and excitingly unfolding itself amid noisy approval as I left a little after 8 o'clock." This description paints a vivid picture of the early days of cinema going. Holloway is positioning himself as an observer outside of the action, and at this time there was a little bit of snobbery in the higher echelons of society around the cinema. It wasn't quite the done thing, as it was associated with wayward children, petty crime and uncouth behaviour. And cinema audiences could, at times, be a rowdy bunch. The Mary Street Picture House, which was on the corner of Mary Street and Wolfetone Street, also known as the Maro, was a large, low-end cinema, costing less than most others. In its early days, fights would often break out, and it could be difficult to hear what was happening on screen, with all the shouting and talking in the auditorium. Popular with children, it would sometimes accept 2 jam jars as admission. And in fact, this was a common way of paying into the cinema, as the glass jars could be exchanged for money. The Dublin Evening Mail in August 1918 reports that a group of 5 boys between the ages of 11 and 15 were convicted of stealing a film from the Maro in order to set up a cinema of their own. And there were reports of children stealing money and begging to afford the price of a ticket. Anxiety arose in some quarters about the influence or the pernicious effect of the cinema on young minds. The Irish Vigilance Association campaigned zealously for restrictions on picture houses and the censorship of films to contain, in the words of Reverend J.S. Sheehy, the pagan, sensual, sordid stuff that is dumped in such profusion on the shores of Ireland and shown with bold effrontery in the picture houses of our cities and towns. Between 1910 and 1916, there was a boom in new cinemas opening, with almost 30 picture houses in Dublin at that time. These were small cinemas seating 400 or 500 people, and like the Volta, they were housed in buildings that were converted into cinemas. Some were ornately decorated, others less so, but they were an increasingly popular pastime, possibly in part due to the cramped living conditions in tenement slums that many Dubliners endured at this time. The bitterly cold winter of 1914 was particularly good for cinema attendance, with Dubliners looking for a warm place to pass the evening. Initially, there weren't any regulations when it came to opening a cinema, so it was seen by some as a quick and easy way of making a bit of cash. However, these makeshift spaces were often hot, stuffy and crowded, with the projector set up at the back of the room. At this time, films were made from celluloid, which is a highly flammable material, so it was a health and safety nightmare. Disasters occurred in many cinemas around the world where fires broke out and panic ensued. Luckily, Dublin escaped any mass disaster, but there were reports of fires in Dublin venues, including one in 1917 in the Clontarf Town Hall, which was in use as a cinema. The projectionist Patrick Cullen and his assistant, a boy called Anthony Cashin, managed to escape when a fire broke out. By this stage, the Irish Cinematograph Act had made it a legal requirement to have a separate booth behind solid walls for the projector and emergency escape routes. Following on from this, we see the arrival of purpose-built cinemas, particularly in the 1930s, when a golden age of cinema building began in Dublin. Cinema audiences had been dwindling during the 20s, but the emergence of talkies and colour films changed all this. It also contributed to the Hollywood monopoly of film in the English-speaking world. At the same time, there's increased building in Dublin as it recovers from the destruction of the Easter Rising, the War of Independence and the Civil War. A second cinema boom took place, with many of the more opulent and luxurious cinemas being built, including the Savoy and the Metropole on O'Connell Street. The Savoy is the only remaining cinema from this period still in operation today. Built on the site of the former Granville Hotel, which was destroyed in the Easter Rising, the opening programme describes it as a luxury cinema worthy of this great city. The opening of the Savoy, performed by W.T. Cosgrave, the Taoiseach of the day, was a high-profile event attended by the elite of Dublin society, which suggests that by this time, a trip to the cinema is a perfectly acceptable pastime for all classes. The architecture and design of the Savoy was typical of the 1930s, in which cinema buildings became more lavish and extravagant. Known as movie palaces, the building itself was a key part of the experience of going to the cinema, provoking the feeling of entering another world which was glamorous and exciting. Although the facade was a fairly low-key classical design, in keeping with the overall plan for O'Connell Street, the Savoy's interiors, which emulated the majesty of Venice, was designed to impress. Seating over 3,000 people, the auditorium featured an azure blue ceiling, elaborate moulded plasterwork, and an arch over the screen in the shape of a Venetian bridge. The lobby had broad marble staircases, as well as an electric elevator to access the restaurant and the balcony on the upper floors. And the Savoy was state-of-the-art. The newest technology was used in its construction. The cinema had a backup electricity supply and emergency lighting automatically powered by a 200-volt battery. This was likely to reassure the public about the safety of the cinema and the importance of emergency exits in light of previous disasters. Similarly, the ventilation system was highlighted in the programme. It reads, "Every 2 minutes, the whole of the air contained within the capacity of the Savoy cinema is completely changed, replaced with air that has not only been washed, but also sterilised, purified and warmed, so that as far as humanly possible, every patron at the Savoy Cinema will be breathing air which is as suitable and proper for human breathing as modern science can possibly render it." Bear in mind that Dublin had experienced the global flu epidemic of 1918 with huge loss of life, and of course tuberculosis was a real and constant threat to the lives of Dubliners at this time. The Savoy was marketing itself as a safe place that was also comfortable, opulent and fashionable. Many other cinemas opened in Dublin around this time, with O'Connell Street and its surroundings becoming an entertainment district. The Carlton was across the road, the Metropole up the street, as well as the Corinthian and the Astor, both nearby. Throughout the 1930s, sound became established and cinemas were moving away from their initial links with the live theatre, although some theatres, such as the Theatre Royal, continued to combine films and live shows. Nowadays, nearly every cinema will be showing the same films, but in the past there was much more variety and lots of shorter films on the same bill. There would be newsreels and short serials known as followy-uppers, which were like TV shows and tended to end on a cliffhanger so that people would come back the following week to find out what had happened. Some cinemas specialised in particular formats. The Ablana in Busaurus and the Grafton showed newsreels. The Curzon on Middle Abbey Street was an art house cinema, and westerns were shown in the Corinthian on Eden Quay, which gave it its nicknames of the Ranch or the Hay Barn. Beginning in the 1930s and continuing into the 50s, we see the expansion of cinemas to the suburbs. The Fairview Grand, known as the Faro, opened in November 1929, a week before the Savoy. It catered to the new garden suburb of Marino, a Dublin Corporation public housing scheme with 1,362 houses, which was completed in 1927. So it had a ready-made audience on its doorstep. Initially, it showed silent films with musical accompaniment, but the talkies were the latest new thing, and like other established cinemas, it had to adapt and was later equipped with RCA sound and added a balcony to increase capacity. The Faro was the first venture of Leonard Ging and architect Henry J. Lyons. On the north side, Leonard Ging was a cinema mogul of the time. He owned or partly owned several other cinemas, including the Strand, also in Fairview, the Drumcondra Grand, the Cabra Grand, the Whitehall Grand, the Sutton Grand and the Colester Grand. Cinemas in Dublin are often known by a nickname, which I think is a typically Dublin way of showing affection for something, while at the same time not letting it get too carried away with itself. So the Drumcondra Grand, known as the Drummer, opened in 1934. It was the first new cinema built after the Savoy, and it was the first cinema that was built especially for sound. It could fit 1,200 patrons and was decorated in silver and green with amber lighting. Dublin was famous for its cinema queues, and this was true in the Drummer too. There would often be a crush in the scramble when the ticket hatch opened. These suburban cinemas of the 40s and 50s followed similar, more functional designs than the city centre movie palaces of the 30s. According to Mark Zimmerman, they had a steel frame clad with brick, housing a single auditorium with a balcony, while the frontage typically included a small shop on either side of the entrance. The Cabra Grand and the Casino in Finglas are two cinemas that meet this description. When the Whitehall Grand opened in 1954, it took a lot of the clientele from the north side suburbs. It was a newer, more modern cinema that was well served by buses, so people from all around could make their way to it. It was built for the widescreen format that came in the 1950s. The Casino opened in 1955 and was one of the last standalone suburban cinemas built during this era on the north side of Dublin. In the 1940s and 50s, Dublin audience numbers peaked, with many people going to the pictures several times a week. In 1954, there were over 54 million admissions to cinemas in Ireland. There was less than 3 million people in the country at that stage. So if you work out the average across the whole population, it would mean that every man, woman and child in the country was going to the cinema at least 18 times a year. The cinema was a cheap and popular form of entertainment that nearly everyone had access to in their local suburb or town. Meanwhile, the city centre cinemas were still popular, in particular the New Electric, also known as the Lek, on Talbot Street, is fondly remembered by many Dubliners. The Lek was originally opened in 1911, but was revamped several times, most notably in 1964, when it was equipped with a huge, curved Cinerama screen, which used 3 projectors and 12 speakers for a multi-sensory cinema experience. An ad in the Evening Press in 1963 announces, "Here is a unique process, so persuasive that it actually puts you into the picture." However, its location under the train tracks meant that, according to Patrick Power, the sound was frequently drowned out by the trains rumbling past. Some cinemas in town at this time were less pristine than others, and known to patrons as hopping Fleapits, in which gentlemen were advised to tuck their trousers into their socks. I came across an anecdote in George Kearns and Patrick Maguire's book, An A to Z of Dublin Cinemas, about the Fairview Grand, that on one Sunday night, which was a popular time to go to the cinema, The staff separated everyone as they came in, putting all the girls on one side and all the boys on the other. And the next week, when the cinema opened, it was empty. Nobody came back. And most likely because the cinema was one of the few places available to courting couples. Ian McCarthy explains. Through the 40s to the mid-60s, you'd see them queuing every night of the week outside every first-run cinema and the more respectable second-run houses. Young couples in the main. How come? It's very simple. There was no place else to go on an evening out. Pubs, did you say? Pubs were all male preserves. Besides, it wasn't the done thing for girls to drink, or for fellas to be encouraging them either. This was Catholic Ireland, where cinema patrons were known to genuflect in the aisle when leaving their seats. Dining out was miles too expensive. No, the cinema, warm, dark and inexpensive, won out every time. More romance flourished in the auditorium than on screen. Of course, the Catholic Church's influence spread far and wide at this time, with the state fully supportive of its ideas, and this included the cinema and what films could be shown in them. In July 1923, very shortly after the formation of the state, the Censorship of Film Act was passed by the Dáil. James Montgomery was appointed as the first censor. Montgomery famously said that he knew nothing about the cinema, but he did know the 10 Commandments, and they would be his guiding force in his work. He took his job seriously, and in his time as censor, he banned over 1,800 films, and he made cuts to many, many more. Up until the mid-1960s in Ireland, there were no age ratings for films. Everything was for a general audience, so a film was either banned or it was available to everybody, including small children. Montgomery and his equally conservative predecessors cut any scenes deemed subversive of public morality, and this included a whole long list of things, including partial nudity, stage Irishness, drunkenness, sensuality, anti-Catholicism, unchristian ideas like reincarnation, hula dancing, kissing, the portrayal of co-education, bigamy, vulgarity and violence. This meant that whole scenes might be cut out of a film, or even words like divorce or adultery, or even Jeepers Creepers, which was a colloquial reference to Jesus Christ, because such notions were unsuitable for the Irish public. In the 1930s, most films coming out of Hollywood were fairly tame, being self-censored by the Hays Code, but by the 1950s there had been a shift internationally, and there were many more horror films and B-movies being made which really were not suitable for children. The limitations of the general rating was becoming more apparent. Gradually, from the mid-60s, as Ireland became less socially conservative, this was reflected in the film censorship, culminating in 2008 with the Irish Film Censor Office becoming the Irish Film Classification Office. Since the 1970s onwards, less and less films have been banned. Film censorship was a form of cultural control, deciding what people could and couldn't see. So it's interesting that at the same time, the cinema was one of the few unsupervised spaces that teenagers and young people could go to interact. And by and large, despite the cuts, films shown in the cinema were a window onto the rest of the world, whereby new ideas, new fashions and different lifestyles could be seen, and where viewers could go for escapism and excitement. Cinema was quite a communal experience and a form of entertainment accessible to all. The only night of the week that tickets could be bought in advance was Sunday, and there was a fierce black market for these tickets, with scalpers snapping them all up as soon as they went on sale and then selling them on the street at inflated prices. Some touts had tickets for all the cinemas and others only one. The difficulty was finding a tout with the ticket for the film you wanted to see. And cinema audiences were much more interactive. There would be cheering and booing at the screen and singing along with the music. The interval, which was a regular part of the cinema, also allowed for people to get up and move around, and this gave space for socialising and mingling during the film. Evelyn Boyle, writing about a cinema audience in the Irish Times in June 1959, describes how everyone was up out of their seats. They were fighting, jumping, wrestling, hiking, standing on their heads, walking on their hands and eating. And the tone of her article is quite disapproving. She had gone with her family to see a film and she didn't feel that the audience was, reacting the way that they should. But it did seem that the teenagers in the crowd were having a great time. Other cinema goers were called a sophisticated side of the cinema. A participant in Helen Byrne's study of female cinema goers remembered her local cinema, saying, "There was a cafe upstairs and all of us, when we'd go to the cinema, we always went for a cup of coffee. That was the first place I ever drank coffee, and you'd sit there feeling real cosmopolitan." As well as patrons being a big part of the cinema experience, the staff too were of paramount importance. In particular, the usher was an important person who you would not want to get on the wrong side of. Part bouncers and crowd control, part welcoming hosts with an air of glamour. Ushers showed people to their seats, managed queues, oversaw fire drills and looked after lost property. Carmel McAniff, usherette at the Theatre Royal, describes her job in a piece in the Irish Times in April 1952. She reports to the theatre at 2:30 in the afternoon. She faces an 8.5-hour day. After changing into her smart red and gold uniform, she lines up with her 17 colleagues for the manager's routine inspection parade. Her uniform has no pockets. Bulging pockets do not make for a neat appearance. An usherette must appear neat and spruce at all times. Jewellery too is taboo, also smoking, sweet eating and unnecessary conversation with patrons. And of course, projectionists were essential members of the cinema staff, as they were the ones who played the film, monitoring the images to ensure they stayed in focus and adjusting the volume as necessary. For every film, there would have to be 2 projectionists and 2 projectors. Bob Tate, chief projectionist for the Savoy, explains, "There were some 2,000 feet in every reel of film. The average full-length feature runs to 5 reels, lasting about 20 minutes. 2 projectors are used. When the spool on the first is running out, the second is put in motion, so that just before the first reel is finished, the second projector is running at the same speed, ready for the split-second changeover. Perfect timing is essential." But the end of the 1950s saw a decline in cinema attendance as television started to make its mark. BBC could be received in Ireland from 1949, UTV from 1959, and although cinema owners had urged the government not to introduce television to Ireland, RTE started broadcasting on the 31st of December 1961. Meanwhile, cinema staff were looking for better pay and conditions. For 6 weeks in the summer of 1961, cinemas across Dublin closed their doors when staff went on strike. The Fermanagh Herald reported, "About 50 houses in all are involved. Since the strike started, the city is more or less deserted at night. There are no parked cars in the streets. Restaurants are closed because men and women workers refuse to pass the picket." The Revenue and CIE were also feeling the effects of the strike, with the city centre deserted, bus takings were down, as were the entertainment taxes normally coming through cinema tickets. It ended with the Labour Court's judgment in favour of the staff, who won a pay rise and longer holiday entitlements, although men got more than women and juniors. The dispute was settled in July, and in August cinemas raised their ticket prices. Cinemas were feeling the pinch and began looking for alternative audiences. There was the yo-yo craze of the late 50s, early 60s, where Billy Panama, an American yo-yo champion, performed tricks and skills and judged yo-yo competitions in cinemas. I met a man who told me that he took part in one of these yo-yo competitions in the Cabra Grand, and he won that round, and he went on to the National Stadium on the South Circular Road for the final, which unfortunately he did not win, but he said that the prize for the overall winner was a moped. Cinemas also doubled as concert venues, with the Ramones famously playing in the State Cinema in Phibsborough in 1978, and then the Cabra Grand in 1980. Bingo was another activity that took place in cinemas. Gradually over time, the suburban cinemas closed down, were converted for other purposes, or demolished. The Drummer is now a Tesco, the Killer has been demolished, the Strand facade remains with the interior converted into apartments, the Sutton Grand and the Casino in Finglas became Super Quint supermarkets and then Super Values. Cinemas that remain viable today are by and large multiplexes. although there are a few smaller cinemas in town. In the 1990s, the multiplex with 10 or 12 screens emerged as the standard cinema design. They are now located on the edges of town and in shopping centres, and the ones that have survived in the city centre have all divided into multiple screens too. The first multiplex to open in Dublin was the UCI at the Square in Tala in 1990, followed by one at Coolock in 1991. Multiplexes have a streamlined, functional design that is mass-produced around the world. They tend to look like large plastic or metal-clad boxes from the outside, if they have a facade at all. Gone are the ornate designs. The seating is generally tiered tip-up seating. Wide screens were fitted with surround sound. Another casualty of the changes in the cinema is staff numbers. It takes far fewer staff to run a present-day cinema. Nowadays, one projectionist can cover multiple showings. Ushers bringing people to their seats are largely a thing of the past, and online booking and credit card ticket machines continue to replace the box office staff. The cinema has been through many changes since the late 1800s, but as a business and as a pastime, it is still going strong. Attendance numbers in Ireland are still healthy, and 2023 saw worldwide increases due to the Barbenheimer effect. When cinema going was at its height in 1956, there were 56 separate cinemas in Dublin. Today, there are only 15, but having said that, most of these are multi-screens showing several different films at the same time. But with television, then video, and now streaming services, the patterns and experience of cinema going has changed dramatically. Dublin's streets contain many old cinema buildings that no longer function as they were designed to. As a city, we would do well to honour these buildings and to remember that cinemas in the 20th century played an important part in connecting Ireland to the rest of the world. They provided a space for youth culture to flourish, and they were fun and entertaining, and they transported audiences to other worlds, other times, and other places.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from Dublin City Libraries. The Dublin City Historians in Residence programme is brought to you by Dublin City Council and organised by Dublin City Libraries in partnership with Dublin City Council Culture Company.